Hello world of YouTube. Similarly to October's past where I talked about the bands Iron Maiden and Ghost for Discography reviews, I'm going to be tackling a different idiosyncratic metal band whose sounds and lyrical sheet more lie in the dark and the macabre. But unlike these two bands, California thrash icon Slayer's sonic palette more falls within the intensity seen in bands like Lamb of God or Fear Factory. Have that same sort of sonic progression that those bands share, in that they have a comfort zone, they sit in it, and expand on it in some choice instances throughout their career. Similarly to a band like Lamb of God, Slayer's also had a relatively consistent lineup. While their drummers have rotated eras, you have your Dave Lombardo era who started the band and left at the turn of the 90s. He was replaced by Paul Bostaff throughout that decade and the beginning of the 2000s, but Lombardo came back before leaving again, and they've always had Paul Bostaff in the wings to kind of fill in the studio when Dave's not around, along with John Deet filling in on tour whenever Dave just has something else going on. And while Gary Holt did guitars for one of their albums, and I'll talk about why when I put that in the ranking, Kerry King, Tom Araya, and Jeff Hanneman have pretty much rounded out the roster throughout the entirety of the band's career. I love the iconic solo work that Kerry adds, while Jeff's throttling guitar adds to the heaviness, and Tom's brand of shouted vocals lend the style of aggression that transcends some of where the thrash scene sort of ended up at the end of the 80s. And his bass styling lends a lot to keeping the groove propulsive in a way that I really like in Slayer's music. In this video, I'm going to be ranking all 12 of their albums from worst to best in my opinion and telling you why. As far as thrash royalty goes, I really like Slayer's highs. I think similarly to some of the bands I've mentioned in this intro, their lows are a little more meddling, but in the case of Slayer, they also have some records that I think are just not that great. Really, the hardest part of this video was sort of rounding out my top spots more than my bottom spots. Either way, give this video a like if you're excited, and let's go ahead and get to ranking. I forgot Slayer made an EP, Haunting the Chapel. It came out between Show No Mercy and Hell Awaits, and I feel like this is like that bridge, that missing piece, the broken of their discography, if you will, where I feel like the band sort of had that smaller pivot into introducing ideas that they would fine-tune on Hell Awaits to make Slayer in the fullest portrait, partially because, one, this was like the point where Dave kind of got more into his own style. You know, tracks like Chemical Warfare and Haunting the Chapel, while still having that flair that was on Show No Mercy, just has those subtle shifts, especially with some of the darkness within a track like Chemical Warfare and Captor of Sin, that feel more in line with the ideas they explored on Hell Awaits onward. Kerry King's guitar play on Captor of Sin, I feel like, is much more in line with how his guitars sort of evolve into their trademark style. And I think this acts as a cool nugget within Slayer's discography that, similarly to Hell Awaits, if you just kind of want more of this early era of Slayer, it's absolutely a place that one should get to. I think that it's got some strong jams. The 4 tracks on the digital version of the EP, I think, are some choice shit that show a bridging of ideas akin to some other iconic bands that I think is essential when really going into the deep crevasses of the band's discography, and I think that it's a cool little piece of it all. With that being out of the way, let's get into their albums proper. Their last album, Repentless, is one I'd never spun prior to this review, because I don't know, I never had interest in it. It always felt like sort of a byproduct of circumstance. You know, it's the only album of theirs with Gary Holt instead of Jeff Hanneman's guitar contributions. To jump back to Jeff for a second before I just completely divert off the subject entirely. Jeff Hanneman died in 2013, so 2 years before this album. They could have just not done an album without Jeff Hanneman, but they tried, and then they said, never mind, peace. Not to say that this album, like, doesn't have any great songs, but, like, it's on the bottom for a reason. It's also got Bostaff, and the Bostaff era isn't all bad. A lot of their lowest lows are from his era, but I'd argue he's not necessarily the sole contributor to that. I do like Dave Lombardo's drums more than Paul Bostaff's, but again, there's some records that Bostaff has been a part of that I like more than some Lombardo records. But there's a sloppy edge to this that reminds me of some of the components of the Bostaff era that I don't enjoy, but have this sheen to it that embodies some of the lows I see in other, contemporaries of theirs as far as the production is considered, with all of the sort of watered down aesthetics that I have issues with in other facets of their discography, only it sounds all the more tired on Repentless. Hell, even them dropping an album on September 11th like this isn't something new for them. The attitude on a track like Take Control just has this sort of aged bitterness that doesn't have the fiery youthfulness of Anarchy that a lot of their earlier work, I think, channels a lot more intensely. A lot of the songwriting on Vices has this sort of just like checklist style to it that I think feels like Slayer trying to recapture the hits, but instead just rests on their laurels and plays them pretty straight. I don't know. Admittedly, leaving this record, I'm a little disappointed, just because, for Slayer's Last Hurrah to sound as slapdash as it does on here at points is kind of disappointing. While the galloping intensity of piano wire feels like it's trying to create uneasement in the air, it just leaves me feeling high and dry and not at all nervous about the environment the music is putting me in.
It's cool that they did include the last song they wrote and recorded with Hanneman. So it's Slayer being Slayer.
And I don't know. I feel like if you're a Slayer fan, or if you've gotten into Slayer after this video somehow, and you want to hear what the worst Slayer album is, in my opinion, which also happens to be their Last Hurrah, throw on Repentless. I definitely think that they could have done better. I think that they have done better when it came to, doing comebacks or, having an album with significance. And Repentless just feels like the heart is there, but maybe it's just a little too old to deliver on the intensity or the consistency that they had in their heyday. Even if I put Repentless at the bottom, I could see somebody putting Diabolus and Musica at the bottom of their own proverbial Slayer ranking, because it's easily a contender for their worst album. It's very similar to albums like Stomp 442 and Volume 8 by Anthrax, or records like Obsolete by Fear Factory that are trying to get relatively trendy with their ideas. This very much feels like an album written in 1998 in some regards. Between its slower pacing across the board and its production that does focus on drums, but in a way that does not do Slayer any favors. This may have some of the trappings of the band's writing-wise, but even then, similarly to Repentless, it's a handful of lyrical tapestries that Slayer just do all the better throughout their discography. Sure, this slower pace and some of the more fuzz added to the bass lets Tom Araya's playing adapt in a way that's different for him in some select pockets. And when the band does get thrashy, it's nice to hear. Again, the production just sets back the elements that make Slayer shine. Like on Overt Enemy, which has the same kind of paranoid, don't be a cog in the machine style lyrics, with less of a focus on guitars and is more bass driven. But the lyrics have this slice of that 90s style of paranoia, at least throughout the lyrics, that I think just kind of sets it back from some of the militant style lyrics and darkness that fueled some of Slayer's highs. In the Name of God is a perfect example of how the production destroys all of the character that you would normally find within a Slayer song, with some of the most flaccid guitar production with drums that just sound way too much. Similarly to Repentless, honestly. Those two, production-wise, in that regard, are cut from the similar cloth. And while, again, I know I'm putting a handful of Bo Staff-era stuff on the bottom, there is some stuff that he's been a part of that I think is pretty choice. Diabolus in Musica is easily just, similarly to Repentless, an offshoot in Slayer's discography that I don't think has all that much merit as far as a necessity to be visited when combing through Slayer's discography. You know, you can tell they're trying to add some sinisterness on a track like Death's Head, but again, without the production to let Kerry King's brand of sinister guitars wail, it just feels all the more new. And as a result, it makes it one of the lesser in quality pieces of their discography. Again, not a place that I think many people need to get to, and overall, these are the two outright skips that I would say lie in Slayer's discography. Now, at this point in the video, I kind of want to say there's a bit of a gap between Diabolus in Musica and Undisputed Attitude. Even if I've used this album as a negative point of comparison to my least favorite Lamb of God album, their Legion covers album they did when they brought back the Burn the Priest monitor, because Undisputed Attitude is a covers album primarily of Slayer doing some hardcore punk and just some hardcore covers with some original adjacent stuff thrown in. There's a side project called Pap Smear that Jeff Heineman was a part of in the 80s, I guess, and there were some songs on here that were also recorded by him back in the day, and Gemini the Closer is an original song that I think fits the energy of this project. Even if I think this ends up lower on the echelon of Slayer albums, what sets Undisputed Attitude apart from a record like Legion is that while I still don't necessarily love the production of this, there are components of that production that feel in line with punk in a way that helps these covers sort of feel a bit more in spirit of their roots. Plus, I think Tom Araya's vocal delivery very much falls in line with hardcore. Especially the Minor Threat stuff. I actually like the Minor Threat covers on this album. And I think that Slayer do a decent job at them, honestly. And I like that similarly to a record like Diabolus in Musica, Tom's bass gets to shine a bit more in the production accents that I also think that the bass play on here is better than the bass play on Diabolus in Musica, and adds to what Tom already contributes. It's like, this is a covers album that makes sense more than Legion, even if I still think that it's not as good, because Slayer are at their best when they're a little bit darker and heavier than what's presented on here. You know, I'd argue this is more of a point of curiosity than anything I've talked about thus far in the rankings, if only because, again, Slayer doing a thing like this is kind of an interesting experiment for them, especially in the 90s, and shows their influence a little bit more tangentially than some of the more darker leaning edges of their discography. It shows their influences a way that are a little bit more tangential to where their sound had ended up by this point in their career. It's still something I don't throw on nearly as much as anything I put above this, but when revisiting it for this review, I honestly had a little bit more of a fun time with it than I did back in the day, and I think that it's definitely an interesting point in their discography, even if it's not my favorite. In 2009 was probably the height of my love of Slayer. You know, while I do still, again, love a lot of their classics, they were just deeper in my rotation back then than I would say they are now. So when World Painted Blood dropped, I was all the fuck about it. I thought that it was a great album. Even though I had started my YouTube channel that year, I wasn't doing current stuff mostly. Had I been doing so, this probably would have ended up on my favorites of the year. I don't look upon it nearly as fondly nowadays, but it is an interesting piece of the discography for a couple of reasons, if only because it may not sound like a Rick Rubin produced metal project, but it's got that same production that he was kind of toying with, and I don't think Greg Feldman's production on here does much to help the band in some choice instances. I was a sucker for the loudness war in the 2000s. I like my records loud, and while now I still enjoy some records that were from that era as far as having that bold production, I don't think that World Painted Blood does as much to benefit the band as the record prior to it. It's also the last album to feature the original lineup in full, and even if it's not the highest on this ranking, it does have moments that I would say are still strong for the band. Unlike everything I've put below it in the ranking, as a full-out experience, I think is at least a point of interest when it comes to original stuff by Slayer. I think that the title track opens the record off strongly and has a little bit of, like, brooding sinisterness that I think kicks the record off on a Slayer-ass Slayer foot. You know, one of the things about this record is that I guess they wrote all of the stuff when they started to record, and that definitely feels like it's the case with some of the lines and ways that Slayer do Slayer on this project. It has a little bit more of a slapdash or less clever spin to a lot of its ideas. Like Hate Worldwide feels like a Slayer song in spirit, and in sound it has that thrashiness that I like, but the writing kind of has a little bit less going on in a way that I think almost skirts the line of, like, self-aware parody.
Which, even with its positives, which I'll get to in a moment, just sort of even this experience out into this sort of blandish Slayer soup, which is very indicative of its very bland-ass album cover.
That feeling all the more accented on another track, American. Like, I get the spin in the title, but it just has that lack of depth that I think Slayer do tap into even at their most surface level on better projects.
I think Snuff's electrifying intro is just a great grappling hook for the listener. I love that same intensity seen on Psychopathy Red, and I think that Carrie's soloing on Public Display of Dismemberment just has that face-melting glory that I like in a good Slayer jam.
And even if I could see somebody finding this to be even more mediocre than I do, I still think that it's at least a cherry-picking experience, if not a morbid point of curiosity if you want to see Slayer playing the hits in the most idiosyncratic way. Like I said, even if I had Bo Staff on the bottom, there's some Bo Staff era records that I think are better than some of the Dave era stuff. That being said, there is still a bit of a bigger gap between World Painted Blood and Christ Illusion as far as that quality level is concerned. While I think that that's the first full record that I think is worth it by Slayer, it's still got some moments that I think could be like a cherry-picking experience. Christ Illusion may be in a similar realm, but it leans more on the realms of if you like X, you'll probably like this. And I think that's partially due to the production being so much better than it is on World Painted Blood. I think that it's got a great modern vision of what I think made the production on classic Slayer albums pop in all the right ways. Plus, given this is the first album to feature Dave Lombardo once again, there's sort of a rekindling of spirits that I feel like went on during the recording of this that brought those thrashy roots back to the forefront in more of a splendorous fashion. You know, there's a mind-melting solo that ignites a mixed flesh storm that is already, like, steeping the listener in the madness. That tracks like Catalyst and Conspiracy just pull the listener through the grit and rubble all the more speedily in the best way possible. Even if they keep some of the more lower tempoed stuff that they explored in the 90s, they integrate it pretty solidly into the track listing here. At least in the case of Eyes of the Insane. I think that, again, it's not a perfect album. There's some tracks on here that I think could have been left out, or at least maybe retooled in certain ways, like Skeleton Christ, which leans more into those, like, Diabolus era sonic ideas, but tries to work them into this, and I don't think is all that successful. And Jihad, which is a track that it felt very much more reactionary in an immediate sense than in a more stewed, thought-out sort of way. Even if I don't revisit this album in full as much as the stuff I like more, I think that if you are a fan of some of the ideas that were sort of refined on God Hates Us All, but you want that Lombardo energy, I think that Christ Illusion is worth it, even if I personally more pick my favorite tracks out of it and keep those in my rotation above all else. While I do think this smaller return of Lombardo had some great ideas by both records, I don't think just met the cut of what I think they were doing with Lombardo during his first run. From the book of Jude for the wicked fight, I keep the Bible in a pool of blood, so the nana. I can see somebody putting God Hates Us All lower on in a Slayer ranking. It's one of those records that I think is a little underrated in their catalog. It's the last album to feature Bostaff during his first time with the band, which I don't think it's the best Bostaff album, but I think was a great sending off to a guy that I think had a smattering of contributions to the band, both good and bad. What makes this album all the more interesting is that its bleak tone kind of felt like it was setting a stage for the coming years, given this was dropped on 9/11. And a lot of the apocalyptic imagery and the sounds of it, even if it has that sort of late 90s, early 2000s style of production that I think weighed down Diabolus and Musica because the band is more tapping into their thrash roots, and some of the intensity on here just is so well harnessed in some choice fashions that the production doesn't neuter the song ideas. I think The Disciple is easily the best song Slayer has written post the turn of the millennium, and feels like a Slayer song that could have ended up on a record like Seasons of the Abyss. There's some imagery within New Faith that I think also kind of hits that same stride and darkness and sort of edgy style imagery that I think Slayer at their peak just wrote so much more consistently. Even if it's still got tracks like Warzone that feel like offshoots from Diabolus and Musica in ways that I don't think are as good. Those are few and far between on this project, and I would say that if you are a fan of some of the later parts of Dave Lombardo's first run, and you want to see that sort of reimagined through a little bit more of a 2000s, late 90s lens, God Hates Us All is a pretty good place to go for that. I think that it's much more a stepping stone record than I think people would ever give it credit. Because, yeah, it's got some of the ideas that Slayer championed that are not as good. They blend it with the ideas that are great and create a much better harmony with it. Hell, while I complain about the production neutering some of Kerry King's solo work when his stuff crops up on tracks like Exile, I think it just hits better on here than it has on anything I put below this in the ranking. Outside of maybe Snuff from World Painted Blood, because that's another, that's a Slayer track that I, again, would say is as good as some of their earlier stuff. While it's got some tracks that feel like sort of the last remnants of Diabolus and Musica by like Threshold and Warzone, even in the case of Threshold, it has some flirtations with that classic Slayer ideology or sort of mentality and mood that I think it just kind of reins in very well. This could be a top 5 Slayer album. The drum production on this should have definitely gotten more of a focus because I do not like the way the drums sound on this record. I think that they sound better than some of the points that I've put lower than this in the ranking. Killing Fields' drums are a great whirlwind flurry, but I really hate the drum production on this. I think that it matches some of the crunch in the guitars, but in a way that I don't think is as good as the way the production sounds, especially on the record prior to this. But I think that as far as Slayer continuing pillaging forth post-Lombardo's department, this is a good transitional record for them. In fact, I think it's a great one given where they ended up going after this project. I also think that, while Tom's vocal production by and large in this project is as good as the old stuff, SS3 is an instance where some gang vocals or something gonna help Tom's voice cut through that kick drum assault that's happening on that track. And in fact, I think that that's a showcasing of where the production as a whole just kind of needs a retooling. It's got some genuine highs that I think rival some of Slayer's best stuff. Ditto Head might be one of the fastest Slayer songs with Bostaff, and I think it's just as intense and feverish as the Lombardo stuff they were cooking around this time. 2 and 3's got this sinister lean to its guitars that I think pop, but could also pop just a little bit more. This is the one Slayer record that I think the most underrated, but only because I don't think it's talked about in the same breath that I think it should, given I think it's easily, even if it's their 6th best record, the strongest record they wrote with bow staff by and large. I think that if you enjoy records like South of Heaven, you should really spin Divine Intervention, because it's got some shit that I think fucking rips. All in all, really strong shit, and I think a great start of what was easily their most meddling era throughout their career. Now, while I can't speak for every Slayer fan, I'd wager most people's top 5 Slayer albums are their first 5. While there could be a multitude of different iterations of said top 5, I think that, like, their first 5 are easily still their strongest records, but their debut is ending up in that 5th spot because I just think they build upon this foundation in so many more dark and sinister ways that I think showcase their sonic identity all the better. I think that Show No Mercy is an interesting piece of the discography. Most of the thrash debuts of the 80s, I think, are an interesting showcasing of where bands' sort of inspiration may have started and sprouted from, where they would adapt into their own sort of niche pockets. I think that it's a great record still in its own regard, and I think that it's got flirtations of some of those darker ideas, but I think that its production and the band's just performances just get more fine-tuned throughout each subsequent release. I do think that tracks like Black Magic and Evil Has No Boundaries tap into some of those and showcase some of those flirtations with the macabre that they would, again, get all the more morbid with, while tracks like Die by the Sword feel more like their version of, like, an 80s-ass metal tune. It's an interesting marriage of ideas that I think creates a good cocktail to introduce the world to Slayer as it is. You know, while I think the guitar play on the Antichrist feels more in line with, like, Kill 'Em All than most of Slayer's work, it's still a really good song at the end of the day. And I think that if you're a fan of older metal bands and you haven't spun Show No Mercy, I think that it's a point that you should get to. They would build upon it and make arguably a better showcasing of their sort of focus after this. It's still an interesting point in their discography nonetheless. Similarly to records like Divine Intervention and God Hates Us All, if you like Slayer, or if you've gotten into Slayer, I think that this is still a point that one should listen to eventually, if not to start with.
Assassinate! Time of your life has expired! Hatred! Victimize! Gaze in their eyes!
When I was at that peak Slayer love in high school, South of Heaven was my favorite Slayer album, and I think that as far as, like, a follow-up to a classic like Rain and Blood, this keeps the energy of that project still throughout its runtime, but does a good job at, like, spreading out those ideas a little more into some ideas that would get fleshed out even farther on its follow-up. It's a good stepping stone release that I feel like if you're getting into Slayer, similarly to some of the records I put above this, I'd put this in the sort of essential listening side of their discography. I feel like if you're starting with Rain and Blood, which I would argue is a decent starting point, following it up with this in your listening is a choice time. You know, the darkness crawling throughout the leads that open this project and set the stage of the macabre, I think, is executed deliciously and enhanced all the more so throughout tracks like Live Undead and the whirlwind solo work that opens the classic Ghosts of War. You know, I think as I've gotten older, I feel like the back end has been the one point that I feel like I don't like nearly as much as the full listening experience of the albums I put above this, but there isn't a bad song on here. In fact, I think above Show No Mercy, I think that this is the first, like, Slayer-ass Slayer album that gets their aesthetic, has their tone, and just makes perfection out of it. You know, while the subjects on tracks like Read Between the Lines and Behind the Crooked Cross are very much Slayer being Slayer, the way that they pulled those tracks together is just classic. While tracks like Silent Scream just bury the listener in thrash excellence. I do love this record a hell of a lot. I could see somebody making this their favorite Slayer album even if it isn't mine anymore. And I could see somebody viewing this as a decent place to start if you're not starting with a classic like Raining Blood. I would honestly make this more akin to like their Ashes of the Wake of their career. They took the foundation or the expansions on a foundation seen on a record like As the Palaces Burn and just refined it a bit more to make something a lot more invigorating as a result and a good bridge between ideas, as it were. And again, if we're rolling with the Lamb of God parallels, Hell Awaits is absolutely the new American gospel of their career. While it still has some of the production ideas seen on Show No Mercy, and it has a rawness to it, even just the title track, Hell Awaits alone, does more to evoke the spirit of Slayer, in my opinion, than anything on Show No Mercy. But also having tracks like The Whirlwind Kill Again, or bass play filled and still vintage as fuck thrash Necrophiliac still add a touch of darkness that I don't think Show No Mercy ever reached, and I feel like act as the true introduction to Slayer as I know them. I fucking love Hell Awaits, and I've always really liked it, but as far as like an album that's grown on me the older that I've gotten, Hell Awaits is absolutely that. And I feel like more so than Show No Mercy, if you're a fan of early thrash and you want the Slayer version of that, Hell Awaits is your album. And I think that it's a better starting point into their career than Show No Mercy, as far as like giving people something that embodies aspects of like their early stuff while having more of the spirit of their golden age material. While I'd argue the guitar play by Carey is a little more in line with his signature darkness on South of Heaven, something about the sound of Hell Awaits has just grown on me the older that I've gotten. Similarly, again, to records like Burn the Priest's first album. It's just a style that I've always liked, but have grown to love more the older that I've gotten.
I also think is like the moody side of the Doom inspiration that they absolutely pulled from like the Hell Awaits playbook just really hits me in a good way on here, man. Like, again, the bass play, the atmosphere, the overall use of its production, I think is just better on Hell Awaits by and large.
With that being said, I do still love Kerry King's leads and the twin guitar leads that coat this thing as a whole. I love At Dawn They Sleep, and I think that tracks like that and the aforementioned Necrophiliac do more to show Tom Araya's bass play a bit better in a way that, not to say that their more champion stuff doesn't showcase, but something about how it is on here just sounds so much more, services his talent so much more, in my opinion. I love this record. It's a thrash classic, in my opinion, that gets much darker in all of the right ways than their debut. Sees the band taking a sophomore outing and really taking it what worked and pushing it more into a realms that they would master.
Raining blood from a lacerated sky, bleeding its heart.
Rain of Blood's one of those records that gave Slayer its identity and took the sinister identity that they sort of continue to adapt on Hell Awaits and gave it the polish it needed to be an instant classic. Tracks like Angel of Death and Raining Blood are staples in the Slayer catalog and are perfect in all the right ways. There's a foreboding tone on Raining Blood that I think kind of masters some of the ideas they toyed with on the title track of Hell Awaits, and I think that the subject matter of Angel of Death grounds a lot of the darkness that Slayer plays with into a reality, given it's about one of the most famous Nazis within Auschwitz. Criminally Insane retains that darkness but puts it into a more stripped back but still kinetic realm. And Necrophobic adapts some of the Show No Mercy guitar ideas and puts them into this madness so splendorously. I love how breakneck that track is. And even if a lot of their sludgier, more slowed down stuff from the 90s is sort of seen as like lesser by and large. Moments like Jesus Saves on this that slow it down but keep the darkness and sarcasm almost sort of permeated throughout it do a lot more to service the band in a good light, in my opinion. The Kerry King's solo stuff just wails in all the best ways. Dave's drums are pummeling and aggressive without being too overbearing on a production side. It's Slayer at their most self-aware while still writing some bona fide jams. And I feel like if you aren't starting with Hell Awaits, you should absolutely start with Rain and Blood, because it's kind of a Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets sort of scenario, where I think Ride the Lightning sort of, similarly to Hell Awaits, found Metallica's sound like it did for Slayer. I love this album, and I think that as far as like essential metal albums, Rain and Blood is absolutely that. That's why I feel like if you aren't starting with Hell Awaits to get a good flavor of Slayer with an earlier sheen, this is textbook necessity listening that one must do, I feel like, if they're getting into a certain brand of metal. Everything is just mixed perfectly to make a cocktail of excellence that I think is incredible. And a lot of people share that. Again, Rain and Blood is heralded as like one of the best metal albums of all time by and large. My love of it shouldn't be anything surprising given the caliber of metal that I do enjoy, and I think that it's easily a record that I would love to own, and I think is essential and important to shaping certain facets of metal.
Provoking images, delicate features so smooth. A pleasant fragrance.
Take everything I said about Rain and Blood, but inject some of the adaptations and sort of tangent scene forced out on South of Heaven, mastered even more on Seasons of the Abyss. While it's the last album to feature Lombardo until he came back in the 2000s, it is a hell of a send-off to him in particular. The drums on this record are fucking blindingly, insanely good. Between the blinding thrashing stuff like the insane opener War Ensemble and Spirit in Black and Hollowed Point, which just channel that darkness full stop, with that same signature twin guitar and sinister guitar stuff from Jeff and Carey, to the more brooding, moody stuff like Dead Skin Mask, which is easily my favorite Slayer song in its style. The writing on it is just creepy and evokes this mood that I think the band strikes brilliantly. The more groovier stuff like Expendable Youth and Skeletons of Society also have those writing topics that Slayer, again, kind of keep in their wheelhouse, but just make classics out of it. As far as like beat for beat, track for track, just being a perfect metal album, Rain and Blood and Seasons in the Abyss are easily Slayer at their peak, and I feel like show an evolution across a 3-album run that they would sort of squander post this, in my opinion. But as far as like having a golden era, Slayer's late 80s, early to the turn of the 90s shit is just peak thrash excellence. There's a bleak coating of this that I feel like drenches the mood in just more darkness, similarly to South of Heaven, but just completely excels and overtakes that album, in my opinion, or at least has as the years have gone on. I think that there's some genuine strengths on here that showcase Slayer in a realm that is above all of their peers in this era. While the turn into the 90s was an interesting period for a lot of thrash bands, I feel like Slayer easily started it off better than all of their contemporaries with Seasons of the Abyss. It's a quality, classic thrash masterpiece that sees them taking some of those writing topics and adding even more sincerity to it in a way that I could see somebody not liking when starting, but I feel like similarly to South of Heaven, if you're spinning Rain and Blood, you gotta make your way to Seasons of the Abyss. It is essential metal in my eyes, and easily the best Slayer album, bar none. And that's how I'd rank Slayer's discography. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know your thoughts on their records and some of your favorite albums in the comments down below. If you did like this discography review, give it a like. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week depending on what I've got going on. It's the Channelversary week. While I won't be doing a Channelversary stream because I have more pressing matters to attend to, I will have a special dropping this Saturday that I hope you're excited for. Either way, thank you again so very much for watching. I've been Viral Rack. You guys are good at lives and situations, and I'll see you another day.